So I can send that to you this week. So if you need the link from last week's video, let me know and I will get that to you this week. But the first question that came in last week that I want to address doesn't necessarily have to do with Christ in the Old Testament, but is a fantastic question. And it does have to do with mercy and this idea of God being merciful and being one, and not just God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament. So I got a question through the week about how do we reconcile the Canaanite genocide with a God of mercy? And if you don't know what the Canaanite genocide is, in Deuteronomy 7, it's not just Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 7, the Israelite people are about to enter the promised land after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. They're about to inherit the promised land. And the Lord commands them as they go into the land to basically wipe out these people that they come into contact with. And it's the Canaanites, the Jebusites, just all those ite people that we run into in the Old Testament. And basically the message as we understand it is the Lord is telling them to go in and annihilate everyone. And so the question that was asked last week is, how do we reconcile that with a God who is supposedly interested in reconciliation and the message of grace in the New Testament with Jesus? And I think one thing to keep in mind is that we are talking about 5,000 years ago. And so the writings in the ancient Near East are not writing with 21st century sensibilities. They're writing with ancient Near Eastern sensibilities. And so the nature of the messaging of annihilation is common in ancient Near Eastern writings. And so if you see in Egyptian hieroglyphs, like the Egyptians went into a city and annihilated everyone. They didn't. There's historical proof that they didn't. But that is the language that is used for that. So we don't know that it's actually a genocide. It's just what it sounds like to us because we are not familiar with ancient Near Eastern writings like they would have been, which was total annihilation language was very common. We also, when it comes to the message of judgment on other nations, even in the midst of judgment in the Old Testament, there's always, always, always a message of grace thrown in. There's always a remnant. There's always a message of grace. So when we get to Genesis chapter 15, the Lord talks about these people living in the land of Canaan and how he's going to stave off judgment for their behavior. And when we talk about the sin that was present in the land of Canaan, it is bad. It's child sacrifice. It's any kind of sexual immorality that you can think of. I mean, they were just engaging in everything, and it was cult-like worship. But I think the worst part of it was the child sacrifice. And so when the Lord was commanding the people to go into this land, he was saying, you need to get these people out before you, because I don't want them influencing who you are and what you are supposed to be. And so as we go through Deuteronomy, as we get into the book of Joshua and the conquest narratives, we see them have conflicts with people in the land. But also by the end of Joshua, we see that they don't annihilate anybody, basically, because they're still the people are still intermixed among them. And even after the Lord gives the command, go and get them out, he says, don't marry with them. Don't do business with them. Because he's trying to preserve a people for himself. And if they intermarry, if they do business, they become influenced by that culture. And it takes them away from being a priestly nation, which we'll talk about this morning. So all that to say is that's a tough question. And it's not something that I want to gloss over because it is present and it's something that people get stuck on. So I don't want you to get stuck on because we don't know enough about it. But I also want you to be encouraged that the Lord really is working grace through history. And there are just some things that we come into contact in the Old Testament that we have to hold with open hands because we don't really understand what's going on. And it's one of those things where you have to ask yourself, is this a big enough deal for me to get stuck here and not move on? Or is this something that I can hold with open hands and trust that the Lord is up to something? So it was a great question. That's why I bring it up. And I don't want to pretend like everything is great in the Old Testament, because there's a lot of bad stuff that happens. There's a lot. I mean, the Old Testament is just a mirror of human nature. And so I never want us to look at it like we are removed from that, because it's just a mirror of who we are as people constantly rebelling against the Lord and how he constantly pursues us in the midst of it. And the second question had to do with how a Jewish reader would view a Christophany, which I thought was a really great question. And the short answer is that Jewish readers do not view Christophanies as anything other than angels of the Lord, messengers of the Lord, because they do not view God as a triune God. They see God alone as Yahweh. He does not take physical form. He does not appear to people. Physical form as a person, like he in the Old Testament, he shows up as the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire. His presence, the smoke fills the temple. But he doesn't take an actual physical personal form. And so for them to view it as anything other than that is blasphemous. So when Jesus comes in the New Testament and starts referring to himself as Son of God, that's why they view it as blasphemous, because A, God doesn't have a physical form, and B, that would involve God doing something to have a son, and he doesn't do that either. So there is no Holy Spirit. There is no Son person of the Trinity, the triune Godhead, because it's just Yahweh alone. And I thought that was a really great question too. So if you have questions through the week, send those to me and I will do my best to answer them. If I don't know the answer, I will do some research, and I know a lot of really smart people who might. So keep those up. And with that, we will get started with this morning. Now, if you joined us late and you didn't get Friday's email, the notes for today are in the chat section. So just let me know if you need if you can't see those, if you need another copy, you can do that. Also, if you need a copy of last week's lesson, that's fine too. Just let me know. Okay, so we are starting in Exodus this morning, and we've got a lot to get through, but I think we'll be fine. And we're starting in Exodus, and we're going to stay mostly in Exodus because it's so important to the rest of the Old Testament narrative. It becomes the cornerstone of the Old Testament narrative. So one of the things that you will see as you continue reading through the Old Testament is how God introduces himself as, I'm the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, to show continuity of who they belong to. And then I am the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That is something, so Exodus is something that we come back to always. And it also becomes, the Exodus becomes a major motif. And we're going to talk about that in a second, in a minute, of how that kind of Exodus nature is continued in the biblical text. So how did we get here? In Genesis 15, we're not going to turn back to that, but in Genesis 15, the Lord appears to Abraham because Abraham is basically like, you told me I'm going to have descendants. I don't have any children. Is my inheritance going to go to this distant relative? And the Lord appears and is like, no, it's going to be your inheritance. It's going to be your son. It's going to be your offspring. And that also is a huge deal, that the nature of offspring throughout the Old Testament. But he also tells him in that same passage, your descendants are going to go through 400 years of bondage in a country that is not their own. He tells them. Abraham knows it's coming. They may have forgotten that. I don't know that that's something you necessarily pass on to your children. Like, by the way, don't know when it's going to happen, but you're going to be slaves. Your children are going to be slaves. They're going to be slaves. It's cool. God will show up. So we know it's coming. So by the time we get to Exodus 1, it shouldn't be a surprise that we are there. So if you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to open to Exodus. And just in the email that I sent out on Friday, and if you didn't get it, I apologize, but I encouraged reading certain passages in Genesis. Did anybody read those? Did anybody read anything in Exodus? It's all right. It's okay. We'll talk about, well, that's why we're talking about it this morning. It's all right. Okay. So in Exodus 1, Abraham's family ends up in Egypt because of plague, because of famine in the land of Canaan. And then Joseph is sold into slavery. He ends up in Egypt, and his family comes and joins him in Egypt, and they stay there, which is fine. So in chapter 1, verse 1 of Exodus, it shows us who all is in Egypt. But then in verse 6, it says, then Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So what we see here, just in the first few verses of Exodus chapter 1, is promise fulfillment. Already we see promise fulfillment, because Abraham's descendants have become many. They have increased, they have multiplied. And it actually also ties back to Genesis, is it chapter 1 or chapter 2, where the Lord tells them to like go and basically multiply and fill the earth. And so this kind of ties back to Genesis 1 with this creation mandate that they're fulfilling, and then also back to his promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, where he's going to become a great nation. And here we see that start to happen in the present, so to speak, in the text. So, but there's a problem, and that's when we jump down to, verse 8. Exodus 1:8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. So that's the issue. And he says, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So the question you might have, and I think it's a legitimate question, is why 400 years? And I think for biblical standards, a generation is roughly 40 years. And so we have 10 generations here of Abraham's descendants that have multiplied within Egypt. And so it's hard to become a nation when you're just a handful of people. And so when we get to this point, we have 10 generations of Abraham's descendants that are about to be led out of slavery to become a nation. And the idea is not that it is like a small handful. It is, they are becoming a nation of people. And so we can never understand the Lord's timing for things, but he always acts well within points of history. So I think it has to do with the amount of people and why it took 400 years. It's a long time. Anyway, so when we get to verse 12 in chapter 1, it says the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. And that's the problem that we have right now, that the people of Israel are being treated horribly, and they're being used as slaves in a nation that is not their own. So that's kind of setting the stage for where the story is going to go next. Because not only is God going to rescue them, he's going to rescue them in a mighty way, which becomes a motif through the Old Testament narrative, is how God shows up in mighty ways to show who he is and what he can do. But that leads us then to Moses, who becomes a key figure in Old Testament lore, in Old Testament history, and even within the New Testament, everything goes back to Moses. He becomes an important figure. Now, Moses is from the tribe of Levi. He's born to Hebrews. We don't have to read the story. We've heard that we're familiar with the story of Moses, but it is in chapter 2 if you need to go back and refresh your history. So because of the Hebrew people multiplying so frequently, and the Egyptian people being so afraid, the Pharaoh passed the mandate basically to kill the children. And so Moses' mother saves him by putting him in the basket, sending him down the river, and Moses is raised as Egyptian royalty. But he still understands his identity, which I think is an interesting part of the story. Moses does not grow up believing like, I'm an Egyptian, it's cool. He knows that he comes from the Hebrew people. And so in chapter 2, beginning on verse 11, he has this interaction where he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and he intervenes and ends up killing the Egyptian. And then the next day he sees two Hebrews arguing with each other, and he tries to stop it. And they're like, who are you to tell us? You just killed a guy. And it becomes a thing. So he flees, he leaves the land, and he goes to the land of Midian, and he stays there for roughly 40 years. So I think it's an interesting thing, because he's probably around 40 years old when he flees into the desert. And then he's in the desert for 40 years. It's not just it's not a sabbatical. Like, he's gone. He retires into this life of being a shepherd in Midian. But we get to chapter 2 at the very, very end of chapter 2 in verse 23 and 24. It goes back. So we kind of divert from the story of Israel to introduce Moses, because it's just introducing a major player in this narrative. We come back to the issue at hand at the very end of chapter 2, and this verse is important. It's 23 and 24. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob, and he saw his people, and he knew. Now, I know this doesn't have much to do with Christ in the Old Testament, what it seems, but what I want to pay attention to here is that in Egypt, we're talking about a land that is filled with idols. Idols made of stone, idols made of gold, idols made of wood, idols that have food presented to them so that they are taken care of every day. These two verses show us in 23 and 24 that God, our God, is a God who is alive, who does not need to be taken care of, who hears, who sees, who knows, who remembers. He is a God who perceives. He's not just a statue that we have to take care of. And this is in direct contrast to what the Hebrew people, or what the Egyptian people know, and what the Hebrew people have been exposed to. Because within 400 years of slavery, they're going to lose touch with the God who appeared to their forefathers. And here he reintroduces himself, and it becomes very personal. So that sets us up for an introduction to Moses, but also Moses becomes a type within the Old Testament. He is called a servant of God. He's also called a friend of God. And so a servant, like only a handful of people within the Old Testament narrative are referred to as servants. And that is Abraham in Genesis, and Joshua and David and the prophet Isaiah. But then in the prophet Isaiah, we find out about the servant. And so Moses just becomes a type that is pointing forward to one who will come and to fulfill that type, to be the representation of that type. Moses also becomes the first prophet, really, within the nation of Israel. And a prophet's role, I think the way we think about prophecy nowadays is like kind of future telling or fortune telling, and that's not the role of the prophet within the Old Testament. The role of the prophet within the Old Testament is to be a mediator between the people and the Lord. The prophet was the one who would come to the people and say, you're not holding your end of the bargain when it comes to this covenant that you've established with the Lord. And we'll talk about that covenant in a second. But Moses becomes the first of these types, these prophets. But then when we get to Deuteronomy 18, and if you have your Bibles, turn to Deuteronomy 18, because I want you to see this and know where it is. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15, it says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers, and it is to him you shall listen. just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of assembly, when you said, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire anymore, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, they are right in what they have spoken. Verse 18 says, and this is coming from the Lord, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. So this is pointing us forward to a prophet who will come, that will be like Moses, that will guide the people, that will know the words of the Lord, that will speak the words of the Lord, and will help the people follow the words of the Lord. So even within, and Moses doesn't understand this, and the people don't understand this, but even within sin and rebellion and all the things that happen, we get this picture of a prophet who is to come. And within Exodus, within the Torah in general, outside of Genesis, Christ is in the subtext. Christ is in the subtext of the law. Christ is in the subtext of the rebellion that keeps happening. He's in the subtext of the relationship between Yahweh and Moses. So he's present, but you got to look between the lines, and we have to pick out these verses as they come and recognize, oh, we're still moving forward toward a specific trajectory. And then in Numbers 24, there's a similar situation with the story of, do you guys remember the story of Balaam and the donkey? And he like beats the donkey, and the donkey's like, why are you hitting me? Anyway, this is after that story. But Balaam basically has this vision from the Lord where he talks about a king that's coming. So even then, even when it's not overt, it ties back to what we heard last week when we talked about Judah and how a king was going to come from the line of Judah, and he would be the one that would lead the people in justice and righteousness. And so Balaam in Numbers also refers to this king and his scepter. And so it's coming. But what's happening here is kind of what's setting up the rest of the story, with establishing the nation of Israel, and the Lord building a people for himself, which leads us to the burning bush encounter in Exodus 3. And we're not going to be able to go through all of this because this is not a class on Exodus. But maybe someday we will have a class on Exodus because it's good. So Exodus 3, Moses has been living in the desert for 40 years. He's joined up with the land of Midian. He's married. He's had sons. He's basically just living his life. And the Lord appears. It actually says an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the brush. So it starts as what says the angel of the Lord, but then it becomes this interaction with the Lord. So it's interesting. Some argue that this is a Christophany because it is the angel of the Lord. It says the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame. But then he actually reveals himself as Yahweh. And so I don't know. It's just one of those things. Whatever it is, God is present in this burning bush encounter. And I think that that's what is important and what we can trust. So Moses is having this interaction with the Lord in Exodus 3. But when we get to verse 14, Moses is asking him, what is your name? Which God do I say is sending me to these people? How will they know who you are? And in verse 14, God says to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So ultimately, I am becomes the name Yahweh, even though it's technically not a name, which I think is kind of a boss move for the Lord when Moses is like, what is your name? And he's like, I am. He doesn't really have one because he is all things. He is what he needs to be at any given point. And which is a really powerful image of who the Lord is. But it becomes within the Old Testament text the name Yahweh, which is divine and sacred. And there's a lot of lore about how scribes would treat the name of Yahweh when writing. And often it is translated as Lord, all capital, in your Bible. And so if you see that in your Bible, that is the Hebrew name for God, which is Yahweh. So moving forward, the I am statements that Jesus makes in the Gospel of John, when he says, I'm the bread of life, I'm the vine, you are the branches. Any I am statement that Jesus makes in the Gospels is tying back to this encounter in Exodus 3. Jesus does not play games in the Gospel. It is no mistake when he appears and says, I am these things, because he is saying, what he is saying is, I am present from the beginning. I am ties back to that. And that also would have been viewed as terribly blasphemous to the Jews at the time, because again, God doesn't take physical form. God does not have a son. And who is this guy, this random guy, to make these statements about himself? But again, Jesus doesn't play. He's not playing. And so those I am statements, go into the Gospel of John and mark them, because they matter, because it ties back to Exodus 3, which is pretty cool. So the Lord, we know the problem, which is slavery. We know the person that's going to be used. It's Moses. And we know how it's going to happen, because the Lord appears to him and says, I'm going to do this through you. So we have the people in place. And whereas before in Exodus, God was around, he made himself known to Abraham. Jacob even had an encounter with potentially the pre-incarnate version of Christ. So we know he is around, but here in Exodus, it becomes personal. He becomes present and personal. So Exodus marks a definitive change in how God relates to humanity. So what's important to remember is that from the beginning, the fall in Genesis 3, with Adam and Eve and the grace he shows them in the garden, and then appearing to Abraham and promising all of these things to him, God is in the process of creating a people for himself that will know him, that are reconciled to him, that love him. And he's working at unique points in history to accomplish those things. And he wants people who will love him and who will love others. And when we get to the law, we see that that's what the law is built around. And then in the New Testament, when Jesus is asked, what is the most important commandment? He sums up the law in those two things, to love God and to love other people. And it has become so trite in this day, like our mission is to love God and to love people, but really that's our mission. That's what we are created to do, to love God and to love people. And that's what the law is. So important texts. I don't think we'll go through all of these just because we don't have a lot of time. Let me see. Oh, we'll try. Okay, Exodus 6, verse 6. Go ahead and turn there. So they're back in Egypt. Moses is with his brother Aaron. They're about to go before Pharaoh, and they're like, we don't know what to do. We don't know what to say. People are not going to believe us. And so the Lord is kind of coaching them as to what to do and what to say. In verse 6, it says, say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment, and will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And that's the point here. He's rescuing them so that they can be his people and that he can be their God. And this, I don't know how many of you have ever read Revelation. It's not one of my favorites, but I do know that I think it's in Revelation 20. It's this similar language that, when the Lord has returned and we've seen this glorious coming, and it all boils back down to this: a people who've been reconciled to him, and they are his people, and he is their God. And that's what we're building toward. And it starts here. So that's what he's supposed to tell them. And then Exodus 9, we begin to see these plagues unfold. And it's this sort of mighty way that it's God showing up in a way that leaves no doubt that he is the one working. So the plagues begin actually in chapter 7, but they continue through chapter 12. Yeah, they continue through chapter 12. But in chapter 12, we see this plague that's coming, that's just going to be the most detrimental of all, and it is the death of the firstborn, which sounds really terrible. But the Lord he gives this opportunity for his people to save their children. And that's the establishment of Passover. So I think let's look at, why not? We're going to look at Exodus 12, 1 through 13. Because Passover becomes a huge motif and a moment of rescue. So 12, 1 through 13, then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons." That just means they can share. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on 2 doorposts and lintel of the house in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night. Do not eat. We can skip that. Verse 11, in this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. So Passover becomes this symbolic representation, not just symbolic, because it's actually the first time it happens, it's actually happening, where the Lord saves the people of Israel. He saves the firstborn. He establishes this pattern of animal sacrifice so that the blood can cover the sins of the people, so that they are provided. And I think that, so I don't know if you remember this. I don't know if it's obvious to you, but Jesus is killed over Passover. And so what here becomes this literal exodus from Egyptian slavery is pointing forward to an exodus from the slavery of sin and death. And where the firstborn of the Hebrews is saved through Passover, the firstborn of God is not. He is given up as the ransom, as the blood that covers the people. And whereas the Passover is something that is celebrated year after year after year in commemoration of this, and animal sacrifices are established, and we'll talk about that in a second. But when it comes to Jesus in that Passover, that he's the final lamb. We don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to worry about our slavery to sin and death or the consequences thereof because of that Passover lamb. So I think what we saw back in Genesis with the Lord asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and then he stops him at the last minute, but he doesn't stop himself when it comes to the sacrifice of the firstborn son. In Exodus, when we see this, the saving of the firstborn and this incredible gift of grace given, he doesn't extend it to himself in the New Testament. Because he's doing it himself. He's fulfilling it himself. So Exodus is pointing us forward to something that is so important, and that is God saving us through the sacrifice of his own firstborn. The Lord saving us through the sacrifice of his own firstborn. So Exodus becomes a motif. It's freedom from the burden of slavery. And Israel, it's Egyptian slavery. And mankind, it's slavery to sin and death. And other motifs, I put these in your notes, that happen within, that we begin to see in the Old Testament, is water. So Genesis chapter 1, where the Spirit of the Lord is hovering over the water. And water in ancient Near Eastern culture represented chaos. And in Genesis chapter 1, we see the Lord who has control over chaos. And in Exodus 14, when the waters part and they walk through the sea, it's the Lord who has control over that sort of uncontrollable element. Exodus 15, what happens in Exodus 15? I don't remember. It's when they have no water in the desert and they're complaining and it's terrible. And the Lord causes water to come out from a stone. And that happens again in Exodus 17, even though Moses gets in trouble for it because he wasn't obedient. Anyway, water becomes this motif. The Lord has control over it. The Lord can bring it when it's necessary. And then when we get to the New Testament and Jesus calms the waves and the water, it's that same kind of idea that ties back to this, that it is only the Lord who can speak over chaos, who can bring something where there isn't anything, who can make water appear and control it, because he is Lord over everything and Lord of the cosmos. And water becomes an important idea of that. And also John chapter 4, this isn't in your notes, but like when Jesus tells the Samaritan woman, she's drawing water, which is true, but he tells her that he's the living water and you'll never run out. It all ties together because it's showing the Lord is revealing who he is. And if we don't look within the Old Testament text, we're missing half of the story, more than half of the story, because Jesus isn't a new idea. He's just continuing that thing. And also bread becomes a motif. So in Exodus 16, the people are starting their journey and the Lord begins to provide this bread in the wilderness, and it's called manna. We don't really know what it is. It's just some kind of bread element, but it was there for them every day. So bread is kind of this life, that because it's food and they need it to eat. And later on in the prophets, I don't think we'll talk about this, but with Elijah and the widow and how she makes food. I mean, it's bread that she makes because bread sustains life. But then when we get to John and Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. He's the one that sustains, where you don't have to go out for it fresh every day. It's there and he sustains it. So this imagery becomes important because the text is a whole. And the writers at the time don't know that. But when Jesus shows up on the scene, what he's saying isn't new. He's talking in language that people already know because they understand the Hebrew text. They just didn't know what they were looking for. And so Jesus kind of shakes that up. But we need to pay attention to what God reveals about himself within the Old Testament text, because it's going to make the picture of who Jesus is and what he's doing when he arrives on the scene in the Gospels that much more clear, because he's not operating separately. He's not a last-ditch effort. He's not this player that shows up and is like, hold on, God, let me try something. It's the plan from the beginning. So in the email that I sent on Friday, did anybody watch that video, that short video about the Messiah? It's so good. But it also, I liked that video because it made me think like, oh, I do know what I'm talking about. But also it was this idea that it's the plan from the beginning. We are moving towards something. And so even when we get little stories like this within Exodus and within, as we move through the rest of the narrative, God is revealing things about himself through these stories. So even if it's difficult to find, Christ is there in the subtext because he's one with the Father, but also because there's this plan of grace that's moving throughout the text. So by the time we get to Exodus 19, we have this revealing of the law, because the Lord is not just rescuing people to rescue people. He's rescuing them to reconcile them and bring them into relationship with himself. The problem is, we're sinful people, and he's very much holy. And so there's that sort of gap between us. And so he gives laws to show how people are to exist in relationship with him. So the Torah is basically the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's called the law, but that's kind of a misnomer, because it's not all law. It's law mixed in with stories. There are 613 laws that are given, and they're not all given at one time. But what the Lord, we didn't talk about this last week, and I'm sorry, we should have. We get this idea of covenants within the Old Testament, and covenants are this sort of unbreakable agreement or contract between 2 parties. And so the first covenant that we see, he makes a covenant with Noah. He makes a covenant with Abraham and says, I'm going to make you a great nation. All these things are going to happen. And that's the Lord taking that covenant on himself. That is basically an everlasting covenant. It's an unbreakable covenant. When we get to Exodus, we have what is called the Mosaic covenant. And that's the covenant that the Lord makes with the people of Israel. This is a contractual agreement. This is a breakable covenant, because the agreement is, and you'll see this throughout the text, you see it a lot in the book of Deuteronomy. The agreement is, if you do these things, the Lord is telling the people, if you do these things, if you follow the laws I set before you, if you maintain your relationship with me, then I will do all these things. And it's blessings for the land, it's blessings for their children, it's all kinds of stuff. So, but it's if then. That's the nature of the Mosaic covenant, is if then, and it's breakable. And we learn that it is very breakable, and we learn it very quickly that it is breakable. Because what begins in Exodus is this pattern of laws and rebellion, and then more laws are given, and then there's more rebellion, and then more laws are given, and then there's more rebellion. And it just continues, because as the rebellion happens, the Lord is continuing to shape people who understand what it is to love him and to love others. So what we look at as a bunch of just cumbersome laws is really grace given by the Lord for people to exist in relationship with him. So what should have taken 11 days for the people to leave the land of Egypt, walk through the desert, and get to the promised land, the land of Canaan, what should have taken 11 days takes 40 years because of this cycle of rebellion and return, and rebellion and return. It just goes on. And I think it's easy to look at these stories and say, guys, just get it together. But I think, again, it's a mirror to who we are and how we just continually mess up. And the Lord is there always saying, just come back, which is really lovely. So the problem is stubbornness and hard hearts. So by the time we get to the prophets, and I'm really excited about the prophets, that will be the last week. So 2 weeks from today, it becomes this theme. The softness of the heart becomes a theme, that the Lord will replace your hearts of stone and make them hearts of flesh, that he will remove that stubbornness and the people will be receptive to him and malleable, because they need transformed hearts. And we see that from Genesis chapter 3, that the heart is the issue. It's this ever competing desire to do whatever the heck we want to do, and not necessarily what the Lord is telling us to do, that are always at conflict with one another. And so the law is the Lord's way of saying, here's what you need to do to be in relationship with me. And of course, the law points forward to Jesus, because the expectation of the Messiah that is promised is that this person is a person who will fulfill the law. He can keep the law, and he can lead the people in how to keep the law. And this is reflected in the language of the prophet like Moses. And it's reflected in the kingship language that was given to Judah and through Balaam. And then down the road to David, which we'll talk about next week, is how this person is going to be so righteous that he will lead the people and how to do these things. So the law points us forward to Christ. And Jesus is also the one who solves the problem of the heart. He fulfills the law. And he also expands our awareness of what the law is, so that it's not just text, it's the heart that matters. And so when you get to Jesus's teaching and he says, you've heard that it said, don't commit adultery. And then he says, but I tell you that whoever looks at another person with lust in their heart has already committed adultery. He's expanding that awareness, because it's not just the action, it's the heart that matters. It's the intention. And he wants people to begin to look inward and not just like, what are my actions? Do they look okay? Am I okay with God? It is, what is motivating me and what is driving my actions? And Jesus expands that through his teaching and what is actually going on, because Jesus is interested in the heart. The Lord is interested in the heart, and the heart being reconciled to him, and the heart choosing him, and not just words and deeds. When we get to Isaiah, actually, the Lord tells the people, it's so bad. In the first 5 chapters, it's so bad, the state of things, to the point that the Lord tells them, I hate your sacrifices. I hate your offerings. They stink to me. It just, because their heart is so off track, it doesn't matter anymore. And Jesus is the solution to that heart problem. Which leads us to the sacrificial system. The book of Leviticus, so interesting things, animal sacrifice. It's really dreadfully boring, and I'm sorry, but it's important. It's very important, because evil and sin are rampant in humanity, and God is solving this problem of reconciling people to himself, even though evil and sin still exist, are still in our midst. And so evil and sin have a direct effect. So if, let's say, I were to steal something from you, the direct effect is you have lost something. You've lost something that belonged to you because I stole it. The indirect effect of sin and evil is that it ruins the environment. So not only did I take something from you and you no longer have it, but you also no longer have trust with me. That relationship is ruined because of that sin. And so evil has to be dealt with if we are to exist in a relationship with God. But if he gets rid of evil, he has to get rid of us. And that's not the way he goes about things. So sacrifice and substitution become the method of grace. And so, which is also a motif. This sacrifice and substitution is pointing us forward, and we can see it now, but they didn't see it then. It was just the Lord revealing that part of himself at this point in history. So animal sacrifice becomes the accepted practice, and that you can learn about in Leviticus 16. Let's actually turn there. If you have your Bibles. So Leviticus 16 talks about this Day of Atonement, and it's one day a year where the priest would sacrifice an animal, and it would basically cover the sins from the past year. This animal would accept the consequence of sin on itself, because life or blood is life, and so that animal losing its blood or giving its blood is life that covers the consequence of sin. So the animal symbolically dies in place of the sinful, and this becomes known as atonement. The Hebrew word is kafar. I don't know why that matters. It's just something. It's kafar. Now you know another Hebrew word. So this becomes known as atonement, but it's all symbolic and it's all temporary. So this is something that they have to do every year, because one sacrifice is not enough to atone for all of it. It has to keep going because it cleans away the consequences of sin so that God and the people can live together in peace. And I didn't write it down, and I don't remember where it is, but there's also this symbolic atonement of where the priest would lay hands on an animal and basically put all the sins on the people on this animal, and then they would release the animal into the desert. And there you go, your sins are gone. But it doesn't last. It's just symbolic, and which means that the problem of sin and evil is still present and has to be dealt with. So they keep doing this practice every year. But then Jesus arrives on the scene and he becomes the atonement. And we'll talk about this with the prophets, but in Mark 10:45, I think this is a good way to end. Mark 10:45. Jesus is teaching. He has this encounter with his disciples. He has foretold his death several times at this point. But when we get to Mark 10, verse 45, Jesus says, "For even the Son of Man," which if you have your Bible, if you have that open, underline Son of Man. We're going to talk about that when we get to the prophets. Because again, Jesus doesn't mess around and everything that he says has weight. So, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." That's atonement language. Ransom is atonement language. So in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, with the sacrificial system, that lamb was given as a ransom for the problem of sin and the consequences of evil. And here, what Jesus is saying about himself, not only is he calling himself the Son of Man, which we'll get to, it is equating, it's tying into his relationship with the Godhead as part of the Godhead. He is calling himself the ransom. And when we talk about Isaiah and we talk about the servant taking on the consequence of sin for all, he becomes the perfect sacrifice once and for all. We don't have to keep sacrificing a person every year because the Lord provided the sacrifice. The Lord became the sacrifice. The Lord did not remove the burden of sacrifice from himself, but he did it because he came to be that ransom for everyone. He came to be that atonement for everyone. And so instead of practicing the sacrificial system, we participate with Christ in this process in two ways. Baptism, where we are raised to life, we experience the death and resurrection. We are brought under the water and brought up in new life. And communion, where we participate in his death and resurrection through bread, the breaking of bread and the drinking of wine or grape juice, as is given in evangelical circles. So that is what. So with the establishment of the law, with the establishment of the sacrificial system, with the exodus from Egyptian slavery, all of those things are pointing forward to something that is going to be for everyone. Because remember the promise to Abraham, the offspring and the people who will be a blessing to others. The Lord is beginning to work that out in Exodus moving forward by establishing this nation who's supposed to be a priestly nation to point other people to him. He's establishing this system that will take care of the problem of sin temporarily, but he's pointing us forward to something that is coming that's going to take care of it once and for all. So I know that the law is not exciting. Leviticus is not exciting, but honestly, I would rather read Leviticus than Numbers. But it's important to see what God is doing, because it's not just the Old Testament. This is the story of the people of God, and we are part of those people. So their story is our story, and their history is our history, and how we got to here. Even though we are not physical descendants of Abraham, we are descendants by grace through faith. And it's our story, and it matters. So, any questions right now? Any questions? It's okay if you don't have questions. You are free to email me this week too if you have questions throughout the week, anything that you encounter. Anything that seems weird to you in the Old Testament, nothing is off limits. It's okay. So, all right. if nobody has any questions, then we will say goodbye for this week. And we will see you next week. I'll get you notes this week. Next week, we're going to talk about kingship. So we'll spend a lot of time with David, with his descendants, and how that goes terribly, terribly wrong. And then the final week will be the prophets, which are my favorite. So with that said, you guys have a great Sunday. And Ian is preaching today, so be sure to tune in. He will it's very hard to preach to an empty room. So everybody pray for him. And we will see you next week.
Thanks, Julia.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, Julia. Thank you.
Yes, bye. Have a good week.
You too.
Thank you. Are you talking? I can't hear you, Norma Jean. Can you unmute yourself? There you are.
Yeah, goodbye. We really enjoyed it, Julia.
Oh, good. Okay.
We all did. So
I'm going to send the link for last week's video to you so James can see that.
okay, that'll be great. That'll be
Yes.
great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.